I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Slee Rickets. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you especially to those of you who've taken a moment sometime this past week to recommend the show to a friend. That is really and truly the way people learn about this show. So I'm grateful if you have. I'm also particularly grateful to all of you who have subscribed to The Secret Show. If you like Slee Rickets and you would like to hear more, and even perhaps more a slightly less filtered version of the show, then do go to sleerickets.substack.com and sign up there. You can put your email address in, and then I'll give you a week free, and you can decide if you like it. There are probably about 3 episodes come out every month, and the price it's very cheap right now. It will go up in January, so this is a good time to jump on. My guest this week is John Dilworth. He is a poet, a producer, a performer, really a Renaissance man. He's based in Atlanta. He is I think it's fair to call him a professional poet, which is to say he does not teach at a university. He actually makes a living by doing poetry. I'm going to have links to his stuff in the show notes. His most recent book is called A Collection of Collections. His website is johnfdilworth.com. I'll have all that in the show notes, and I'll mention again at the end of the show. He was an extremely good sport. I gave him homework. I asked him some difficult questions. He could not have been nicer or more generous with his time and his thoughts. This ends up being kind of an unusual interview. He and I have, I think, very different poetry backgrounds and maybe very different tastes in poetry, but we found a lot that we could dig into together. It's also at times maybe a slightly more contentious interview than the typical one, at least on my end. He was rather saintly throughout, but I think you will enjoy it. I think it will provide some variety and maybe stimulation, and I do hope to hear from all of you about your thoughts, and to hear, and I hope you'll go check out his website and his work as well. There's a section I ended up cutting out where we spoke about Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I cut it out, as you might guess, because a lot of it was redundant with the recent episode I did all about that book in particular. So if you want to hear more thoughts about Man's Search for Meaning, you can go to episode 82, I believe. Not the last episode, but the one before. With that, let's get to my conversation with John F. Dilworth. We've got a bunch of, I think, really juicy stuff to talk about. So at the top of my mind, because by far the most controversial guest I've had on so far, not you yet, you might, who knows, there's still room to grow, but is a guy I had on sort of recently who makes more so than anyone else I've had on, a significant portion of his income comes from selling poetry. Right, rather than teaching poetry was one of these essays is about, and plenty of other things people do. Like he makes a significant portion of his income from the poetry, like doing the poetry itself. He was controversial for other reasons, but I think maybe not totally unrelated reasons. I think in some ways. So you are also in a pretty unusual position for most poets that I know, in that poetry is actual making and delivering poetry is a real part of your how you sustain yourself. Is that accurate? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically one of those things where with poetry, one of the ways that I feel about poetry is that it's not just the words that are written on the page. Poetry for me is more of a way of life. The way I express myself is poetry. And so here's an interesting tie.
Okay.
So a lot of my, all of my professional life has been really in technology. I was a Microsoft engineer for years.
Okay.
And I was always writing, But even within the ability for me to grow within organizations, I was always advancing when I was working in that environment. And I think that the poetry in me was a big part of it. I'm not a super technical whiz kid,
Okay.
but when I had to communicate with stakeholders and things of that nature, the poetry that is in me is what allowed me to connect with people.
Right.
And I think that I could make a connection between that and the way I made money. And now, with poetry being an even larger part or a more direct part of how I make money, how I grow financially, it's because it's not just the poetry. For my book, I had to go and I made it a lot more than just poetry. I partnered with a photographer. I mean, it's in 1,500 DPI. It's crazy, but you're getting more than poetry when you engage with a lot of what I do.
Well, okay, so I want to maybe clarify something because I'm fascinated by what you just said, and you are in that way like I think like a man after Dana Gioia's own heart because he was like a business guy who then shifted and ended up working as the running the NEA for a while. He was at Kroger or something, I think. You remind me too of some of my friends who work in technical fields. As it has turned out, a lot of their greater success has come not from their ability to execute at this high technical level, but to communicate about that with the people who don't. Like being the person who can do that, but then also can like stand face to face and have a normal conversation with somebody turns out to be a really valuable skill. So that was part of what you experienced. It sounds like.
That's exactly what I experienced.
Okay.
And some of the folks, even some of our mentors, will say, "Yeah, well, now when I speak to you, it's like you're a person who's got the left brain and the right brain activated." And I think with technology, yeah, it's kind of like being able to be the bridge because there's this one box of semantics with all these different ways to communicate in the technical terms. But then there's also just people understanding one another despite their knowledge level. But as a poet, it also allows me to bring a part of that into poetry. I mean, there's poems that I write where I'm speaking about the cloud and stuff like that, right?
Okay. So then, all right. The thing I wanted to clarify though is you said that part of what makes poetry sort of viable for you as a part of your occupation, and even specifically in your book, is that it's not isolated. It's integrated with photographs and prose and other forms of storytelling and whatever else. But then you also a moment earlier said poetry for you is something broader than just like verse on a page. So what does that mean? How are you using poetry just to mean like anything that's art? Or like, is it like poiesis, like the old Greek sense of like all making? Like, how are you using poetry?
A great example is a production I'm working on right now. So,
okay.
So my most recent volume of poetry that's been published is called A Collection of Collections, Black American Poetry.
Okay.
So Black American Poetry is a production I'm working on. We're going to be having a season of a show called Black American Poetry.
A season, and like there's an in-person, like a touring show. Okay.
Exactly. So we've done our first episode of this show at City Winery, Atlanta. And in the show called Black American Poetry, the first episode is John F. Dilworth. I did a collection of collections live. Now, in the future episodes of the show, there will be episodes that feature a poet, but there'll also be episodes that feature a person who does something else that is Black artistic expression, Black American artistic expression. So poetry in the sense of however you are artistically expressing yourself. And in this sense, as coming from the African-American experience. Now, I also will do things like motivational speaking, for, things like that.
I'm super curious about that. I have a ton of questions for you about that, but we'll get to that later. So yeah, you do a few different things, and so the way you're using poetry is like in the old Greek sense of like all art. Everything we would call art today counts as poetry, and then specifically you focus on Black American art. made in different
Exactly.
genres. Okay.
Hmm.
All right. Okay. That makes sense to me. And I want to dig into some of what you do specifically with that, particularly in the context of this Dana Gioia essay. So I sent you a what I'm now realizing, based on some of the responses I've gotten, is probably an overwhelming list of like possible articles. But you you were totally game, and you were like, oh, good, a podcast interview that makes me do homework,
Yeah.
and you were completely willing to dig in. So I was very grateful for that. But you chose two, I think, complementary pieces. One quite long and one quite short. Can Poetry Matter, which is a famous old piece by Dana Gioia from the Atlantic, and then Americans Have Never Loved Poetry More, But They Call It Rap, which is one of those titles that sort of gives you the whole thesis very efficiently,
Right.
by John McWhorter, and that ran in the Daily Beast. And that was the Can Poetry Matter came out in 1991. The Americans Have Never Loved Poetry More. It sounds like the date here says 2017, but I think the original date was 2014. I think that's right. And they have like, yeah, we'll talk about like how relevant they both are to today, which I think is maybe there are a few different levels of relevance. But just first, I'm curious, why did you choose these two out of my big crazy list that I sent you?
I think they both kind of jumped out at me as kind of definitely related to my experience with poetry in America, because when you look at the way that people interact with poetry these days, it kind of always has this shell on it that presents itself as maybe something that, isn't what we think of as poetry, but really when you peel back the layers, it is. And so that's the same for me. A lot of my influences as a poet are not the famous poets. They are
Okay.
some of the famous rappers.
Okay.
And so, things like that are very relevant to my experience, and especially in trying to keep poetry or even bring poetry to a higher degree of relevance in the way people view it today.
You referred to this sort of shell or veneer that sits on top of poetry. Now, I can think of a couple ways. You're talking specifically about like the veneer or like the shell people encounter when like what he talks about is just like the general public bumps into the idea of poetry. They have this. There's this sort of force field they bump into. What is that? How do you think that? What do you think that means to most people when they when they encounter the word poetry? What is that shell exactly? If I've characterized that accurately.
I think that's the thing, is that they don't encounter the word, they encounter the shell, right? So here's
Okay.
here's an example. Um, I've seen some commercials, a few of the larger brands out there, right? And they'll have a very dramatic commercial with some beautiful music playing, and you hear a narrator um, giving you something, during the Super Bowl or something, big time commercials, and that is poetry. The things they are reciting, those are the types of things that I would
Right.
even love to do more of, right? So that is poetry, but it's not going to really get the accreditation to say, oh, this is for people to receive
Sure.
it as, this is traditional poetry I'm consuming. They're
Yeah.
thinking this is traditional marketing and advertising I'm consuming,
Yeah.
right? So poetry gets kind of understated, but it's the core of what gets the message across.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So that I had it backwards. What you were saying, like there is that we run into a lot more poetry than we would acknowledge, than we would
Yes.
bother to call poetry. And I think you're totally right about advertising, good, bad, or otherwise. It definitely has a genetic connection to
Yes.
poetry. Like it's James
Yes.
Dickey famously like was an advertising writer and like claimed probably falsely to have come up with "Coke is it." And when I worked with a group of comedy writers here, a lot of them had connections to the advertising world. My brother is a very good comedy writer. Is not brother, my brother-in-law is a very good comedy writer. Works in marketing, and like that's. I think you're totally right about that. I think sometimes that common bloodline is good, and sometimes it's not so good. But I think that is related in the same way that David Yezzi talks about poetry being related to joke writing. That kind of that sort of sprung construction in preparing people to have a response to something, building up a punchline or building up to a punchline. That's all part of the same family tree.
Poetry is woven. It's woven into all of that.
Yeah.
If you look at Richard Pryor on stage,
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh
right?
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That is a poetic performance that is being viewed. If you're willing to accept that poetry is always under the shell, and the shell in that sense is, oh, people are consuming comedy without really realizing that this is beautiful poetry that we're also witnessing. And the one that was first, thinking about the commercials, a lot of times those are standard poems, written and somebody's reciting it. In the sense of comedy, it's not structurally the same as a standard poem, but as if society would begin to realize more that what you are experiencing is poetry. I think the very word, when you experience the word poetry, now people have a connotation of it that is more mainstream.
Oh yeah, no, right. I mean, so all right. So you're maybe like shell then is like you're using this to mean like
A
a
facade
disguise,
almost.
a yeah, wolf in
Yeah.
sheep's clothing, or vice versa maybe. And I do think like you're right. This structurally in terms of the prosody, rhyme and meter and sound in that sense, poetry and joke writing is not related, but I think rhetorically it is, and even imagistically. Like I think any stand-up comic will tell you that like German Shepherd is always going to be funnier than dog, and with poets, like you want the specific image, you want to get as crisp as possible because that's gonna stick in the mind more, and it's going to make a punchline land better, or a closing line of a poem land better than a broad generalization will. So I think they actually have some real similarities. Just to dive for a moment into this big swampy, but I do like I've made fun of Dana Joy on this podcast a number of times. I do think he is pretty fucking smart. like this is a smart and it is a well researched essay. The big argument of the essay is twofold. One is never has it been so easy to earn a living as a poet, which boy does not feel relevant today. That does not feel like that doesn't. I mean, I read that. I think the last time I read this was like 10 or 15 years ago. And boy, it is dated. And so, I mean, I think in ways that he would probably celebrate and to some extent because of things he did. But then the other part of what he says is that poetry is although the poetry job market at the time was booming. I would call that a bubble, and I think that bubble has sort of more or less collapsed at this point, or come close to collapsing, for building up MFA programs and positions. But then the other half of what he says is that poetry is dead to the general readers, and it's dead to a particular category of the general readership that he points to, which I'm curious about. I'm curious about your thoughts, where he says basically there's like a 5 million person population in the United States, and this was in 91 again, that is educated, that reads serious newspapers and sees serious theater. I mean, if 5 million people go to see serious theater, I'll eat my shoe. But I think that he's pointing to like a particular very much minority but still significant population that is sort of interested in high art, he would say. And he said like it's not just that general readers are not interested in poetry anymore. We don't publish poetry much in newspapers for general readers to read, but also people who really care about fine art don't especially care about poetry. They're more interested in they'll sooner go to a classical music concert than they would go to a poetry recital. I mean, that's certainly true. Like my parents would go to classical musical concerts fairly often. I mean, my sister is a classical musician, so that helped. But like they would go to that stuff fairly often. Unless it was me, I don't think they would go to a poetry recital. I mean, and like it's hard to blame them. But I think although the academic aspect of this essay, which is granted a big part of it, is not really that relevant anymore. I do think that he's probably still right about that other population. I'm curious. You came from a business perspective, business background, and based on at least some of your poems that I've seen you recite, you had a fairly hardscrabble upbringing. did you like, what was your encounter with the academic poetry world, if any?
So my encounter with academic poetry is pretty much none. Um, you know,
God bless you, sir.
for yeah, for me, that's never been my path.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that I've found myself in places in my life where the path that I've taken, people say, "Wow, oh, I didn't expect that." Right? So yeah, academic poetry, not very much at all. When I was in school, I was thinking in terms of technology.
Yeah.
So academic poetry has never been my style. When you think about the market for high end art, right?
The
And then
market
you
for
think
high end,
about
art. Yeah, yeah, sorry.
yeah, when you think about the market for high end art consumption,
Hmm.
and then you look at poetry and the performance or recitals of poetry. A lot of the poetry recital that I've been exposed to is the spoken word.
Yeah.
And when you think about where does the spoken word happen, it may be at the grungy place that is kicked back. No high society may not be
Right.
the ones who frequent
Yeah.
these types of places. So when you look at the spoken word, when you go to hear or engage with poetry, it's very different from the academic poetry that you read in the publication format, right?
Yeah.
Because performance poetry takes on a whole different culture. It's got a street culture. It's got a scientific culture. I mean, it's so many different, a theatrical component to it.
Yeah, a
So
lot of
there
theater
are big,
kids.
big
Yeah.
pieces of it, yeah, that may or may not be fit into the framework of that consumer of high end art.
On the one hand, I want to say like grungy no account dives like the presidential inauguration, but like I think you're right. Like generally speaking, like that is the exception, and there's a reason that may have had the impression it did, made the impression it did. But I think
Yeah,
because spoken word poetry is designed to engage the audience. It's designed to be
yeah,
fun, right?
yeah.
Academic poetry has never tried to be fun. I mean, isn't fun? Isn't like so seldom have I gone to academic readings and had people even sitting in the audience feel like they were there expecting to have a good time. Like they're expecting to have a bad time. Usually, they're expecting to go there and like do penance in a way. And I do kind of wonder with I know my parents appreciate music, and clearly my sister and brother-in-law are very serious musicians. But like I think a lot of people of like a lot of upper middle class people go to the symphony not just because they personally love music. I think that's changed a little bit. I think it's not as bad as it used to be, but I think for a lot of people it was sort of like it was a version of going to church in some cases. I mean, church can be a very sincere undertaking for people, but it can also be a place where you go to dress nice and be seen. And I think for a lot of people, classical music performances can be that. I had the connection I had not made before that I think you just highlighted is between spoken word as a cultural phenomenon and bohemia, which is sort of can transcend class. But like there are rich bohemians and poor bohemians. There are educated and uneducated bohemians, but they all care about art, and so you do end up getting kind of an interesting mix of people. And I mean, and it can also cross race lines. There is kind of an interesting mix there. How would you, if you had to give a definition to in a vacuum to somebody who knew nothing about any of this, how would you distinguish between spoken word poetry and what you encounter elsewhere as what people feel, what people recognize and say that is poetry, whether or not that's the only poetry they're really encountering?
So the difference between spoken word poetry and you
What
mean the
people
kind that
call
we're finding with the
what people
shell?
call poetry, not formal means a different thing, but page poetry is the other term I use.
Gotcha. The biggest difference, of course, is the difference in listening and reading. Those two different things have a whole, they create whole different worlds, right? So when you're reading versus when you're listening, that experience by itself, for even if you haven't encountered poetry, you can think about reading music versus hearing it, or reading a speech versus hearing it, or reading a novel versus listening to it on the Amazon the one with the audio
Oh,
books, right?
Audible, yeah, audio books,
Right,
yeah,
right,
yeah.
Audible. So even if you don't know anything about poetry, just think about the differences you already know between reading versus listening. Then once you take it a step further, the emotional responses, I believe that spoken word can evoke versus those that reading does, those are very different too. Because that's a very different dynamic once you add in the vocal tones, once you add in the movement.
Yeah.
So when you're going to encounter spoken word poetry, for me, I like the fact that there is a theatrical component to it. And if I were to describe it to someone else, I would think of it as a theatrical version of what you read, where you can actually engage your other senses. You know, you can engage not only just your mind when you're reading, but when you're engaging spoken word poetry, you're using your eyes, you're using your ears. The temperature in the room matters.
I think spoken word, as I've encountered it, feels very much of a piece with stand-up comedy, with rap, in that in all three of those, the words are very important, but also important, and not just also important, but inextricably important, is performance, is
Yeah,
delivery, right?
yeah,
And like John McWhorter in this piece says that, he says, hey, Jay-Z just published a whole impressive book of rap lyrics. And that's fine, and you can do that, and like rock stars do that too, and whatever. And in some rare cases, that can work well. For the most part, it you sort of want to hear it. You want to hear it aloud. I mean, like even we have another co-host who's a big rap aficionado, and he just sent us a couplet from Aesop Rock that I read it and I thought, this is impressive to an extent, but honestly, I just think it would be better if I heard it. I think like it kind of needs to live in the ear, and I suspect that, I mean, certainly, like, I can't think of a single comedian who would want. There are comedians who write books, but I can't think of any stand-up comic who would want his delivered material to be rendered in print and published in print. Like, you wouldn't want someone to read your jokes. You need to be able to
yeah.
deliver them to make sure they land.
You know, I don't know whether I classify myself as a written poet
Sure.
or a spoken word
Right, right, right.
performance poet, right? It's like I don't really, but I think when I write, I'm writing in performance a lot of time
Yeah, yeah,
because
yeah.
I'm writing with a rhythm, right?
Right.
But I've asked people, I said, well, when you look at this book that I put together, it is a coffee table format book. So it's got very, very rich and deep photography from the streets of Atlanta.
Yeah.
And then it's also got the poetry to complement it. And I've said to people, "Oh man, this needs to be heard." I don't know if it hits the same or if you feel it when you just read it. And I've had people look at me almost like, "You can't be serious." When I sat
They don't
here and I read,
they don't, they're skeptical that there's a difference between how you perform it and how you would read it by yourself quiet on a page.
they're almost skeptical in that the impact that they feel is different. And I was very much taken, and I've had that response multiple times where I'm like, wow. And it makes me feel good to know that people are still reading and able to give poetry the attention it deserves when they read it.
Yeah, okay, so I am I'm skeptical in the opposite direction. I've just found that most spoken word poetry on the page is pretty flavorless. It often feels like the as with like pop music lyrics, often it what can be incredibly soulful when delivered in a human voice with a particular persona attached to it can feel sort of flat and thin on the page. Honestly, that's my feeling about Dana Gioia's poetry. Like, Dana Gioia is a really smart critic, but his poetry, I mean, he's one of the marquee new formalist poets, and I have not read that much. I mean, I should read more of his poetry, but when I have read poems of his, when people have said, oh, look at this, look, I think like, that's like a fine pop song. like it's not that musical. Like he doesn't have a great ear for meter, to be
Yeah.
honest. He just like it's not like I wouldn't let him, I wouldn't I don't know what the equivalent like I wouldn't let him go on a date with my sister. Like I wouldn't let him scan my poems. I don't know like that doesn't seem like his forte. But I feel like that's totally been my experience with spoken word, is that as with stand up, as with rap, as with pop music of any kind, I want to hear it performed. And I think like where there's an additional element to this that I think is not always true of like American standard pop music, because of a lot of American standard pop music, it's sort of like stuff that anybody can cover. Whereas with rap, with stand-up comedy, with spoken word, and I would even say with some insta poetry, with people who get into like, and like that's part of the guy who came on before is a version of an influencer. He's a particular stripe. He's not the Rupi Kaur type, but he's sort of an influencer in that part of what people are getting when they get his poetry is his persona. It's coming from him, and that's part of what makes it land. And I think most spoken word I've encountered also has that quality where it part of the enjoyment of it, part of the effect of it, is that it's coming from this person. You know, Richard Pryor's a genius, and he's a verbal genius, and he's a theatrical genius. He's a genius in composition and in delivery, but also he knows, and this is part like I think like stand-ups talk about finding their point of view, and like he knows that it's not like even another very talented performer would have a hard time performing his same material. Because part of it is that not in all cases. In some cases it transfers, but in many cases it
Right.
needs to come from that person. And I think some of the poetry I've heard you read is so personal that it feels like it's personal in a way that is actually it's important that it actually is you saying it, that your persona is
Well,
attached to it.
here's something that I think is very interesting,
Okay.
because as you were speaking, you kind of arrive in the vicinity of where my head is. The
I'm getting there. I'm working on it.
no, this
Okay,
this
please,
is great.
please, yeah.
When you consider where it comes from, and that's kind of how you arrive back at like the actual person, right? When you look at where it comes from, then you look at that person and find out if you ask them where it comes from, right? Because we may say, oh, it comes from Richard Pryor, right? But if we ask Richard Pryor, where does it come from? He may say, this comes from my pain. Or he may say, this comes from my story, right? Now, once you take it down to that level, there are some things that are so powerful that when you engage with them, they can kind of transcend what you expect to get from that format. So I've had people come to me in tears after reading poetry and having never heard me before recite it, but they've only had my book and were coming back to me saying, this is what I read and this is how it moved me so. And so I think that there's this interesting thing that when the source of what you're writing, like you said, if you're writing so that you can one day be, read in the school,
Yeah.
what is the source or
You're
the
doomed. Yeah, you're doomed.
yeah, what's the motive? And so when I write, my writing is to motivate the masses. I'm not writing to be a poet. Poetry is just one of the ways I'm able to share what's in my heart, what I want to express. And I think because of that component of it, that gives it this additional magnitude that impacts people, even if they don't get a chance to encounter me performing it or reciting it on a stage. And that's been really breathtaking for me and humbling.
Okay, well, that is, I mean, to me, that's a successful example of what some people call page poetry. Like, I mean, when somebody asked me the definition of poetry, a slightly snotty answer I gave a few years ago was poetry is the art of making strangers cry using as few words as possible. And like that's something, if you can do that on the page with nothing else, that is however you want to call it, literary poetry, conventional poetry, page poetry, whatever you want to categorize it as, that to me is related to spoken word poetry. But I think there's a like when spoken word poets say, as they should, they make fun of academic poets and their inability to perform well, because academic poets are famously terrible at stage presence. And that's a very accurate criticism. But I think what spoken word poets are missing sometimes is that when your verbal art evolves in a setting in which you are constantly performing it aloud, often what can happen is that the performance carries a lot of the weight. And it should carry a lot of the weight, right? I mean, like when you write a script, and like that's something that like beginning playwrights lose, is they try to pack everything into the lines. You have to leave a lot out in order for the actors to have something to carry on stage. So you have to leave it. You can't. Sondheim writes about getting lessons from, who is his mentor? Rogers? I can't remember if it was Rogers or Hammerstein, because I can't remember which one does which. But he was one of his mentors said he would write, in certain cases, extremely plain and spare lines, because he knew that the music was going to be big, and the music, you needed to leave room for the music in there. And so I imagine if your poetry is evolving in that setting, it's sort of like the reason that like we don't have dragons. The reason like dragons don't make sense evolutionarily, like dragons meaning like a giant fucking reptile that also has huge wings, that also has like often like 4 giant paws with giant claws on them, and can breathe fire, and has huge fangs and big horns and everything. The reason we don't have that is not just because evolution never provided it, but because all of those different elements that did appear in various animals used up the budget, right? Like the budget for that kind of creature is an insanely enormous caloric budget, and nature is much more streamlined than that. I mean, I think it's why like I find a lot of spoken word poetry is incredibly powerful, but then it loses something on the page because it had to lose something on the page, because it had to leave room for that performance. So do you find yourself writing differently? Do you find yourself adjusting? Do you find it that it's just...
Yeah, so the thing that is the X factor is the source, right? So when you are, so the passion makes a difference, especially when you look at the larger body of how I view poetry, right? So even in a room talking to the CFO or CTO and CEO, the words that come out of my mouth may not rhyme or be what I've written on paper, but it may end up having the impact of poetry. When I'm writing on a piece of paper or even using my phone, it's not necessarily my skill that I want to say I can give all the credit to. A lot of it is what has made me who I am, that provides something unique when you encounter it. So when people read the poetry that I've written from my book, I've had people who have the types of encounters that I would only think happen when they encounter the spoken word. But because it's not about me, it's not about the spoken word or the written word, it's about the message and the motive behind it, the passion that I'm putting into it that makes it different. That's why when you mentioned a Richard Pryor, I responded because I know that he was passionate about what he does, and that creates a power that goes a little bit further.
I mean, I think that's certainly true. And like most poets I know who are like, not poets I know, most poets I love, dead, alive, whatever, of whatever background, of whatever time period, whatever. Most poets I love, I mean, all poets I love have, there is passion that is evident. Sometimes it's deeply buried. Sometimes it's closer to the surface, but it's there. If it's not there, if there's no passion, there's no poetry, I would say. But I don't think that's... Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay, so and this would be cool if I could share 2 poems.
Oh, yeah, you want to do a poem? Yeah, please. Yeah, all right. Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so the first one, listen to each of them as if you were reading it on paper, but also process it at the same time as you're hearing it and experiencing my voice.
Okay, right? I'm going to say, I will do my best to do that, and I spend a whole lot of time reading poetry, and so and like I have a background in theater, and like I think I will be pretty good at doing that. Pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that's a tall order. I think you're actually asking something difficult. But go for it, and we'll see.
Simultaneously.
All right, I have a smart audience. We'll give them
Okay.
a test. All right, so we're going to try to. The test is you're going to deliver something. We're going to try to simultaneously listen and also imagine just reading it cold in a room by
Yes.
oneself. Okay, all right,
Yes.
go for it. And you got a title. You're going to do these separately so we know which one is which.
I'll do them separately.
Please. All right, perfect.
The first one is called Pride. Pride will put you in a box, confined with locks that others have the keys to. And the only way to let them release you is to sacrifice that pride, white flagged and peaceful. Humble is the way to avoid becoming your own prey or a prisoner to what you say. Be mindful and in control of what you display and leave open for interpretation, vulnerable to attack and interrogation, negative exposure and humiliation. Be low, and they can never bring you down or cause you to drown in your own pride.
Okay. Do you want to do both and then talk about them, or talk about them separately?
Yeah. So now I'll do the second one.
Perfect. All right, go for it. So that was Pride.
Mm-hmm.
All right, go for it.
And the second one is called Love's Respiration. Black child on a blue night. The red bright. The dead might welcome him. Or maybe he gets another chance. Maybe the Lord saved the last dance for the upbeat as opposed to the down. A sea of people let him drown in concrete and steel and keep it real. But love's respiration provides resuscitation, and he comes back to life, scratching his head in frustration. Like, what just happened? The last thing I heard was scrapping and clapping. And then he remembers back when his mama let his tears drop like eye drops, and how he always wondered why Pops never could get away from the cops or the blocks. Cooked, crack, call it rocks. 8-ball in the left pocket on the corner when the boys roll up, hold up, stop the madness and the potential maternal sadness. He never knew about the legacy, but love's respiration is filling him and bringing it back like Black fathers released from prisons and imaginary boxes, and he breathes fresh air for the first time. But his wound is still bleeding. His wound is still needing medical attention. He's living on adrenaline, exuberant as he begins to realize that he's been given an extension. There must be something greater out there, or I'm just one lucky Nick. But deep down, he realizes there's got to be something bigger and brighter, and he breathes and experiences love for the first time, though he had been the victim of a hate crime against humanity, against his sanity, because even when he spoke to himself, his words were poisoned with profanity. But in this bloody silence, he is able to hear something and feel something that he has never known. And he is damn near grown. So many tainted seeds sown that his roots have been suffering. And some had the nerve to frown upon his strange fruit. And someone suffering just like him had the nerve to shoot, to end his life that was never really begun. And as they run, oxygen begins to fill his right and left lung, and he breathes an awakened breath in miraculous resuscitation, brought back to life, that he may live in love's restoration.
Okay.
Now, the first one was a poem which, if I ask you, could you imagine reading the first one on a poem and having a similar experience with the hearing of it? Just the first one. What do you think?
I think the distance between the experience hearing it and the experience reading it would be smaller with the first one.
And the second one was
Needs
more
the performance more.
performance,
Yeah.
or like it was heavily performance oriented. Right.
Performance and I think persona as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. So everything I write is coming out of my voice.
Sure.
So, but the first one was kind of written in a structure that would work well on the page.
Yeah. And
whereas
it's depersonalized. It's broader.
Yes, it's more flat. But the second one has all these intonations and the breathing and all that stuff. The part that has really blown my mind is that people have read poems like the second one, and without hearing my voice, have been moved much more than you would expect.
I believe that is the response that people have given, but I do think that like there are a couple of factors to consider. So a thing that Joya does say in here that I think has some relevance still is that poets are not really being paid to write poetry. He said they're being paid to educate, and I think you literally give inspirational speeches that are poems. So you're an inspirational poet in the most direct, straightforward way.
That is the motive behind the reason why I'm there. If you're seeing me on a stage or in a classroom or whatever.
I'm sorry, if you're seeing me, it's like you're Batman. It's like if you're seeing me, you fucked up. No, it's like if you're seeing me, then you are at a company or a school, and
then most likely, pretty much 9 times out of 10, the reason why I'm there is because I want to have a positive impact on you. Right. That's the reason why I'm there.
I am curious though because here's something I've always found about didactic poetry myself is that if in order for me to write didactic poetry, first I would have to know something. Like I would have to say I know this, I got it, done, I believe it. I barely ever know something enough to say I feel so confident in this that I don't need to question my understanding of it. I can just deliver it to someone else. I mean, I'd feel that with my daughters usually when it's something like, here's how you put your pants on, don't do it that way, but very seldom do I feel that way about something in a literary context. So first you have to know something, and then you have to kind of commit yourself to delivering that message to an audience rather than, I guess, doing the other things poetry could do. You need to entertain, but then I think of Robert Frost saying that you should always write into the darkness. You should always be writing with an uncertainty of what it is you're finally after, because otherwise the result can be kind of pat. And I find that my response to a lot of didactic literature is that it feels sort of inert because it's arrived at a conclusion, it's done.
Well, sometimes I am commissioned to write for a particular thing, right?
If they commission it, then that's what you're. Yeah. I know. I'm with you there. Yeah.
It's always a weird feeling because if there's a particular thing that needs to be commemorated, or if there's a particular loss that we're dealing with, then it's writing with this, almost a lot of times in those scenarios, I'm envisioning the moment. I'm envisioning the audience, and I'm writing to them, and I'm writing for a very particular reason. And then sometimes these things are just coming to me, and they end up coming together in a way that becomes a poem. So I would say depending on, there's not just one way or one approach, right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
every writer has to arrive at their own sincere approach, I think.
So did you say you write, sometimes you write elegies on commission? Like you write poems of mourning on commission?
Yeah, yeah. I've
That's
written for all different
that's amazing.
types of like events, like if something is happening, and they say, "Well, we want you to." I think the most interesting part about that is it feels like being locked in the cage for a minute, right? Because it's like, man, and the pressure that comes because
Yeah.
someone is saying, "Okay, well, there's a agreement that you're going to provide this
Right.
outcome and that people are going to to be blown away by it." And it's a very interesting place to be because the pressure is there, but then it just and a lot of times it comes down to the wire, right? But
Yeah.
I still love it. I still love those poems just as much as I do the poems that were completely of my own accord. You know what I mean? So
Oh, yeah, yeah. You're talking about like, do you write for funerals sometimes?
I have before.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Because I know people will like bring in a professional singer to sing at a funeral or sometimes even dance. But like, I had not thought about that. But people have commissioned you to come give an original.
Here's
Yeah.
one you probably
Please.
may
Yeah,
not have
please.
seen. You may not have seen it. So in my when I was a young guy and I got married young, I was reciting a poem as I went down the aisle,
You recited a poem at your own
and
wedding?
people were just dead. I mean, tears.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
It was crazy,
You got a captive
but
audience though.
I've
You got them
always
lined up for you. If you can deliver a poem and like not
oh
stumble and not trip over your feet and like and have be
as
sincere,
you're
like
walking, yeah, and
you got
still,
those
yeah.
people teed up for you. So yeah, yeah, you could.
I've always been kind of. It's not the source of it. I keep going back to the source, the source of where it comes from.
What is
Is
the
I
source
think
for you?
what fuels. For me, the source is love. Love is where it comes from for me because I have a love for the people out, the people I haven't even met. I still love.
I had a good playwriting teacher who used. I don't know. Is that my dog or your dog? I don't know.
Not mine.
No, yours. Okay, all right. So it must be mine. Somewhere must see somebody coming to the porch. So yeah, I had a playwriting teacher who said that the most convincing and satisfying motivation for any line was love. But part of that advice was also it's got to be specific.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be a generalized
Oh, I'm
Jesus like
sorry.
radiant love.
Here's
It's got to be a
something.
specific love. Yeah, sorry. Go
Here's
ahead. Go
something
ahead.
very important that I want to mention. So I look at my life, everything I do in my life, as under this umbrella when I found purpose in my life, which was when I was 21 years old. Motivation for the masses. So that's the name of my first two books, Motivation for the Masses, Volume 1, Volume 2.
You found that purpose when you
Motivation
were
for
21?
at 21 years old, spiritually, I came into understanding of my purpose on the planet. And that is to motivate the masses to do
Okay.
four things: appreciate their blessings,
Okay.
learn from their mistakes, think optimistically, and use what they've been blessed with to be a blessing to others. Everything in my life is I want to influence people to do those four things, not just through my poetry, but through the entire way that I live my life.
I mean, I definitely here. All right, here's the thing. I have super mixed feelings about inspirational speaking and about self help books and this sort of mode of communication. My sister loves it, but my sister also does it. Like she's one of the very few people who will read a self help book and then do all the things in it, and then her life will be better and all those. Like it works for her. She does the actual program and then improves herself, and she loves that stuff. And so for her, I can't dismiss it. It's like it's great for her. I find it. I find myself very resistant to it. A question I have had since I first heard of you and started kind of looking in and like learning more about you is who is your primary audience?
Yeah, that's a question that I get a lot. and I've always had a problem answering that. And
Okay.
I've always kind of I've always dealt with that when I speak with people who are wanting to get the message to more people, right?
Oh, don't worry.
No,
I'm not
no,
going to step on your game. I'm not going to
no,
try.
no, 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 no,
Anybody who listens
not
to this
saying
knows
that.
I am not inspirational. I'm the opposite. So I'm not going to steal your audience. Don't worry.
No, no, not at all,
Yeah.
not at all. No, no,
Yeah.
that's not what I'm even alluding
Yeah.
to. What I'm saying is
Okay.
that when I've had that question, it's like if I'm talking to a person who's want to, potentially be my publicist. Right?
Oh, I see. I see. I
They may
see.
want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
know
yeah.
that,
Right. 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 Right.
or
Right.
my publisher wants to know that, and
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
don't have a target audience. I
Okay.
don't. Now,
Oh, okay.
I
Okay.
now my voice is a voice where I am making it clear that I am a young Black African American born in the 80s. And I think that when people who don't have the same experience as me hear my experience and passion, it opens up a door and it builds
Right.
that bridge for understanding. And that's the same thing that I did in technology when I would help stakeholders understand why they're paying so much money for a solution. The
Mm.
same way now, I'm able to take people don't have an experience like mine, use my words and my voice to share where I come from, what people who kind of have my background have
Right.
experienced, and how we see the world. And I think that helps to build bridges.
Okay. I have follow up questions, but that is an interesting. It's an interesting observation about what it is about you and your work that appeals to some listeners and readers. I mean, and to clarify, like I was not. I am less interested in. Well, I mean, I guess I'm interested in who you're aiming for, but it sounds like from the beginning, your goal was everybody. Your goal was
Everybody.
wide audience, all people, anybody. Like the thing I'm most interested in, I guess, is like your audience, not in terms of your aim, but your audience in terms of the response. And that, like, I have been surprised personally. I am, as I've sometimes described myself, a dumb lefty atheist, and a surprising number of my listeners are, well, smart. They're smarter than I am for the most part, but are very religious and very conservative, or moderately religious and moderately conservative, which has surprised me. I was part of what was somewhat startling to me was just to give you like my own approach to this. Is I got, I think it was like a secondhand email text message via my dad, but I was recommended to look into you by my uncle, who forwarded a video of you doing a live performance of a poem, or I think you were sort of speaking and there was a poem, sort of poem and speech interspersed. What startled me a little bit seeing when the video that my uncle sent, because you were very, I mean, incredibly poised and confident and clearly like very polished in your presentation, both speaking. I mean, part of it was like a long introduction by a guy, but then you spoke very like fluently and confidently and clearly, and then you kind of lapsed in and out of poetry, or it seemed to be either some poems or excerpts from poems in a way that felt very, very confident and practiced. And you were a very, very effective performer. Also, you were, I'm going to call you young because I think we're the same age. So you were young. You're young, like young Black guy speaking, in moves like speaking about a a pretty challenging and in some ways hard upbringing, and specifically like Black American upbringing in a room that was super white and super rich. Like that was what I was seeing on the video, and like the venue seemed like a very Tony. It seemed like almost like the bar at a high rise, building or something. So it just gave me pause and made me wonder, like, well, what is both like it's super impressive that you've got this whole room wrapped around your finger doing this, and it's like a room of people who don't share a lot of things with you, but clearly do share some things with you, like clearly do connect with you on some level. And part of that has to be, as you said, they're connecting with, like, they're getting introduced to something that to them doesn't already go without saying, which is this kind of background. But then they also connect with your message. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say primarily it's a feeling that I think it's like, man, I wanted to, hopefully have a positive impact on somebody, and I see that I am. And that is the, it's almost kind of like a vain statement to be like, man, I'm kind of getting off on seeing this thing work.
No,
But it's like
that's
seeing
just
that
being a
positive
performer. Yeah, yeah,
impact
yeah, yeah.
is like, it makes me feel like, man, I'm doing the right thing. Let me keep doing this more and more because I see that it's giving value to people's lives.
Okay.
And even you talked about, you alluded to how when I'm talking, a lot of times people don't even clap for my poetry because they don't know when a
Right.
poem is ending or
Yeah, yeah,
beginning.
yeah, yeah.
I'm just weaving some of the things that are on my heart into what I'm sharing. So I don't even put any emphasis on this is a poem.
Right,
I'm
right, right, right,
just
right, right.
sharing, and it just flows that way. And many times when you see a poet at the beginning, you know what it is. It begins and it ends, and there's applause or snapping of the
Yeah,
fingers
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
whatever the case may be. For me, typically there's none of that because
Right.
nobody even knows that the poem is began
Yeah.
or ended, but they feel the rhythm, and they're like, "Hey, what just happened?" when I
Yeah,
when
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah, yeah,
transition
yeah.
out of it, and
Right, because
it's cool to see that.
no, and it, I mean that is quite striking, that kind of lapsing casual movement in and out, and that is something that, like, holy shit, at like academic poetry readings, famously, there's like the worst moment in an academic poetry reading is the moment when the friendly banter breaks and we turn to the recitation of the poems, and then you think like, oh fuck, she's doing poetry voice. No, the fun is over.
Well, maybe you can invite me to one. I'd like
You
to
should,
take
yeah. I
on
was
that
going to say
challenge.
that is where spoken word poets are right. Like academic poetry reading does need something. We need some lifeblood. Need some kind of shit, break something up, change something up. So okay, so there's this moment in Eudora Welty has this memoir called One Writer's Beginnings that everybody recommended to me. My beloved mentor gave it to me. I think it's incredibly boring. I could barely get through it. But there's one great moment in it. The great moment is she's a child. She's riding on a train and she's looking out the window, watching the landscape scroll by, whiz past her. And then she catches sight of a house in the landscape that's whizzing past her, and she sees the house pass by her. She's a little child, and she has this moment where she realizes, oh, for them, I'm the one whizzing past.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're not actually whizzing past. It's just because I'm the one looking. So she realizes the limitations of her own perspective. So here's what I wanted to figure out is like, I wanted to figure out what was the train and what was the house. When I saw this video of you doing a performance to a bunch of rich white people, and I don't mean to speak dismissively of rich white people. Like I've got a lot of rich white people in my life, and they're great, But like there's like the contrast was striking to me, and the fact that it was my uncle, was the one who was a conservative rich white guy. Like, but he had encountered you in this context. When I saw that, was I seeing you in that room because that's just who I am? Like because I got recommended you because you came to me by the recommendation of a rich white guy because like that's where I come from, or was I seeing that because that's a typical room that you're in, right? Like I guess that's my question.
That's a very good question. The rooms don't get typical. It's almost like
Okay.
not being able to define the target audience.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. And your target, as you said, is everybody. Your target is
yeah.
comprehensive. Yeah.
So for an example,
I'm talking. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
just this past Saturday, I was at Georgia Tech, and there's a group of young people. There's about 30 kids, all from different high schools in Atlanta, a part of a 3-year program, and they meet at Georgia Tech on Saturdays. And I was there, spent probably an hour and a half, 2 hours with them, going through a talk, sharing some poetry, things like that. Um, so and then the event that you're referring to, if I'm thinking about the same one, if you kind of pan the camera around the room, it was definitely a mixed bag of people there. Now these people were all pretty much working professionals, but
Yeah.
in terms of the wealth levels and in terms of the ethnic demographic, there was a
variety.
there was a variety there. There was definitely a variety. It represented Atlanta fairly well. It represented Buckhead really well.
Okay.
But then I have been in rooms where the only people in there are rich white guys.
Yeah.
And I've been in rooms where the only people in there are people who don't have homes. Um, I've I've been in Iraq, in Qatar,
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it's troops and they're getting together for a Bible study, and I'm in
Right,
there and I'm
right,
sharing some poetry. So
right,
I've done just it's a funeral, a
right.
wedding, what the rooms have very, very, very wide.
Yeah, that is. I mean, and that's something I have always liked about Christians who practice what they preach, because Jesus had dinner with prostitutes and he had dinner with rich guys and tax collectors. I mean, he said he would sit down with anybody. So like that part I very much, and I think yeah, Somerset Maugham, who says that the writer can go to anybody's party. The writer can go to the rich parties. The writer can go to the poor parties. He can go to the bohemian parties. He can go anywhere. And so you're the common element, but you cross through a lot of different contexts. Here is a concern I have that I wonder if you have a response to, because it's something you've thought about a lot more than I have. A concern I have about a message like Man's Search for Meaning, which is effectively you can overcome any difficulty, no matter how hard you have it, you can rise up and you can beat the odds, and you can make meaning out of any hardship. And when I hear that, I think on the one hand, like, I could never disparage somebody for doing that, for making that. He survived the worst conditions imaginable, and he made something, and I could never speak ill of that. I mean, that's an astounding act. But applying it universally to others sometimes makes me want, like, part of what I wonder when I hear a message like that spoken to a crowd of rich white people is, I think sometimes I wonder if that message isn't appealing to some people who have a lot and like keeping what they have, because it's in some ways a way of saying, like Dana Gioia. Dana Gioia in this essay is extremely nostalgic for other people's poverty. He's extreme. He speaks very highly. Oh, the good old days when all of those poets were poor. He's a rich businessman, but he likes thinking about, like, well, it's good for them to struggle and be poor, and they can, if they really have stick-to-itiveness, they can come up. They don't need a handout. They don't need help from me. And I think on the one hand, if you are struggling, then it is probably good for you to think, I need to do everything I can. I need to rely on myself as much as I can, because that's what's going to give you the best chance at making something for yourself. But on the other hand, if you are somebody who is in the position of giving a handout, that message might be appealing to you for a slightly self-serving reason. Does that make sense?
I mean, it kind of makes sense. I think in
But
terms
tell me
of
I'm wrong. Argue with me. Don't worry. Just, yeah,
well,
I don't mind if you, yeah, but
no, no. I mean, it does. It kind of makes sense. I can see a part of that in terms of when I'm delivering a message, in terms of the motive behind it. The motive behind me delivering a message is always to create a positive impact for whatever it is your use case for it is.
yeah,
So even if you're extremely uber wealthy, and
yeah,
the way you view life may be completely different from the way most people who hear my message view life, I still want there to be something in there that can have a positive impact on you. And each person that hears it can find their own way of how it's relative in their own lives, and how hearing it can have a positive impact on them. Because it doesn't always have to translate into an action. It could be translating into just your mindset, or it could be
sure, sure, of
translated
course, yeah,
into
yeah, yeah.
your level of optimism, or whatever it may be. There is a positive thing that can be extracted from what I have to say, no matter who hears it. So,
Oh
and it's
no, I don't think you change. I think you're extremely consistent, and I think the message that you're delivering comes clearly from a very sincere place, and a place of, like, deep learned experience, and like you have built this knowledge and you've paid for it, as like you've built something up yourself from less than other people might have had. But but I wonder if the message is received differently by different people. I think the message, I think
The
you're
other thing
totally right.
is,
You're
that's
spreading,
what, yeah.
you're trying to reach out to everybody. You're trying to improve, positively affect everybody. I just wonder if, for example, like I often find that the people who are fondest of tough love are the people who tend to see it applied to others. And I don't mean that the tough love doesn't apply to them as well, but I think, again, if the message is no matter what you can overcome,
Mm-hmm.
then I wonder to what extent people who are already
Don't need
very
hope.
comfortable might say, I don't need to help then. They can
Yeah.
overcome.
Or well, if the message is a message of hope,
Right.
and a person who doesn't need hope hears it because they already have everything that they would hope for.
Right.
There are other components of the poem that, or not just the poem, of their interaction or engagement, in that setting, that could impact them in ways that only they can share, right? Because I've had people who hear something and you would think this applies to them, not at all.
Right.
And it ends up moving them in a way where, in some kind of way it impacts them. I've literally had that to happen to me, where the well-to-do person is at the end, like, man, coming to me in a emotional place saying the poem that you shared impacted me in a positive way.
And it might be one where you would say, well, why would that impact you? But it's something that you can't predict, that touches people in ways that you might not know ahead of time.
Exactly. Yeah. Some
Okay.
people may, because there is a generic message, and that generic message has something that I think may universally be understood in the English language. But then there's some things that are encapsulated within the whole performance or the poem or whatever it is that is not necessarily, it's the reading between the lines. And there's things that people can extract from that. And when they get it, even if they aren't in a place where they need the motivation or they need the push, they may have everything figured out in life, but there's still more. And the positivity has no limit. And every time you encounter with me, some of that positivity is going to rub off.
So I gave an introduction to a poet at a conference recently, and one thing I said about him was that in his poems there's always a hook, and nobody has ever let off it, least of all the poet. And this is talking about David Yezzi, and I do feel like in his best poems, I leave them feeling a little uneasy because I feel like he is. It's sort of like the. Do you know that amazing painting? I think it's Caravaggio, the Vocation of Saint Matthew, where there's Saint Matthew is counting coins at one end of the painting,
Okay.
and then Jesus enters at the other, and he just points, and there's this ray of light that crosses the dark. It's a very dark painting, but there's this ray of light that crosses, and St. Matthew's wearing his fancy, he's like rich guy, he's wearing his costume. He sort of looks up like, oh shit, like Jesus has seen me. That there's, and that's the sense that I think in a good poem, often I will feel. A. Stallings has a wonderful poem called Empathy about the Syrian refugees and being comfortable while other people are suffering, and that's a lot of, I think, the poems that have a moral or political or even didactic component that I most value are the poems where I leave them feeling like, oh shit, like I got seen. Like I can't ignore this anymore. I can't pretend that I'm not on the hook. I'm on the hook too. And that's what I imagine that has to be like. You want to be positive. You don't want to be tearing people down. That's part of your style. Like that's part of just who you are, your personality, your style as an artist is you want to be positive. But it seems like there has to also be some element of wanting to hold people accountable, wanting to keep people on the hook. Does that make sense as a construction or as a?
It does for some of the poems that I've written. Sometimes I'm sharing things that are kind of, almost corrective in nature. Like this is the way it is, but it shouldn't be this way. And it's up to each of us to help to make it change. There are some poems that have a tone to them that are very much like, no, there is something that you need to do at the end of this. There's something that I have to do at the end of this. And if we don't, we're in a much worse place than we are even now, right? So there is some of that. But then the majority of what I'm sharing is all about extracting the purpose, the positivity within you and increasing it. So I'm usually when you encounter my poetry, it's going to be building you up or edifying you in a way that it doesn't require much tearing down of you.
Sure.
Now, the people who know me, we may interact more, right? A poem may lead to a conversation, which leads to a much tougher way of interacting, right?
Oh,
You're
sure,
dealing
yeah.
with even harder truths.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
that poem that you hear, for the most part, for me, my intention is not to
You're not trying to ruin anyone's day.
correct. Yeah,
You're not
it's
trying.
more
Okay.
so to edify, just to
Okay.
build up and to
Okay.
encourage.
I wonder if that's not a form of entertainment. Like, I feel like my wife talks about loving to listen to certain kinds of podcasts because where she just likes to hear people explain things. And I don't know, sometimes I feel, because I totally understand that feeling. And I certainly get that feeling watching certain kinds of documentaries or reading certain kinds of articles where there's almost like there is the savor of education. There's the feeling of like, oh, this is improving me. But that's, in a way, I think that can be a variety of pleasure. That I don't like. I don't know
Yes,
that.
yes.
I think that may be a form of entertainment in itself.
A lot of
So
folks consume that stuff and are not like your sister in that they don't apply it. You know,
no,
they
yeah,
just
that's true.
read
Yeah, my
they
sister
just
is
read the
very unusual.
self-help books
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and a lot of times I'm reading some books and I'm not applying everything that I find in some of it because I will read some of the like the 10x rules and
Okay.
the different stuff out there. I'll read it just to pull the positivity out of it myself,
Okay.
but I don't really apply to the letter,
Sure. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
things I hear. I'm just pulling out little things that some of them are a positive addition to
Yeah.
my, way of seeing things. And
Yeah. Yeah.
some of it is stuff that I, don't keep on board with me as I
Yeah. Yeah.
move
Yeah.
forward.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
but I think there's definitely an entertainment aspect from it because some people are when you're being passionate, especially, and it's performance art,
Yeah.
then without a doubt, entertainment is the that's the
Yeah.
that's the framework
Yep.
that you're working under, and that's a different framework from that academic poetry, page poetry framework. So it's kind of a beautiful thing to be able to move in and out of the both of them to a
Yeah.
certain degree.
Yeah. So the two big knocks on political, like I'm thinking of like anti-war songs, like Vietnam War era anti-war songs. Like the two big knocks on political art tend to be, one, that it's often not very good as art. And we've talked about that, and we've talked about kind of like how you approach your, like the response you want your audience to have, which I think is crucially. Any poet who is not thinking about the response that the reader will have at the beginning, just like at least on impact, at least as my co-host Cameron says, I think he's quoting Jeffrey Hill, but he says the poem has to survive first contact. And like, if you're not thinking about that, I think you're not doing your job. But beyond that, the second big knock on political art tends to be, well, it's not very effective politically. Like, it doesn't, like, you can have even like all the greatest war songs, all the greatest anti-war songs in the Vietnam era didn't stop the war. And maybe some people would say, well, eventually they did. But I'm curious for you, since part of what you are doing is instructive, inspirational, didactic. Like, you are, as you said, you are doing this in order to motivate people, in order to change lives. And the poetry is the tool to get there. You do motivational speeches for, as you said, military settings, business settings, all sorts of settings. If some organization has you come and give a talk, and we can boost you, we're going to have links to all your contact information, everything, whatever you want me to link to, or let me know. What effect do you anticipate having on a group of people who have you come to speak? What, like a week later, what will be the residue?
They will. So what you're going to get is people coming together. When they come together, they collaborate more effectively. And that's what I seek to do with my voice, is have a positive impact and bring people together. So whether it's a team environment that, the team is fractured, organizational environment where there's inefficiencies in the way we communicate, those types of things, even in a classroom setting, at the end of the day, I want you to walk away feeling motivated and positively impacted to do whatever it is you're working on, as well as if you're interacting with others, how to come together and overcome the divisions that may exist within your scenario.
That was this week's show. You can find John at his website, johnfdilworth.com, or on, as he says, all of his social media, presumably Twitter, Instagram, etc., at John F. Dilworth. I am very grateful for his generosity in coming on, and I do, as I said, I hope to hear from y'all what you made of this slightly unusual episode. I've had a few unusual episodes in a row lately. I think the next one is going to be sort of pure sugar, which will be the Risk episode I teased in the recent Secret Show bit. I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving and are getting ready, finishing up. I know a lot of you are in universities. I hope you're finishing up your semesters happily, or at least relatively frictionlessly. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. And with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.